I'm not a fan of the phrase finding your passion because it implies a sense of fun that the activity you're pursuing will always be pleasurable. And that's just not a realistic perspective, nor is it often that reliable in the long term. What you think you may like may turn out to be not that fun after all, and some things you think you dislike may actually be things you should pursue. So Victor's getting deeper into his scientific studies, and he feels he's improving in his knowledge as well as increasing his excitement. He says the more he does, the more exclusively I pursued it for its own sake. That application, which at first had been a matter of duty and resolution, he now does late into the night without even noticing that the sun has come up. In other words, he no longer considers his studies studying or his work as work. He loses track of time when he's working. This is actually a sign of someone pursuing a passion. It's not about happiness, it's about focus and doing something for its own sake. This is what we all should try to find. Yes, sometimes in life we have to do jobs just to pay bills, but if we can find work that we find fulfilling, regardless of pay or duties, and it engrosses us so deeply that time flies by without our noticing, this is a good sign of something worthwhile, something we genuinely care about. So if you're a student majoring in a field just because you think it'll make good money, or because your parents want you to, or because you think this is a new trend in culture, everyone's doing it, you probably won't feel as much intrinsic value, that personal passion, as finding something that you can't not focus on, and you must do, just for the sake of doing it. So find something that obsesses you. So Victor, he's on the right track. He's learning a lot in school. He's found something he truly cares about, and he's being brave in tackling something new. He says, "How many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries?" In other words, what could we accomplish if we just pushed a little harder? It's a great point, but this enthusiasm is a double-edged sword. What might look like great opportunity might be danger instead. We can become blinded by our ambitions. We're so optimistic that we ignore the potential problems. Perhaps people haven't accomplished certain things not because they weren't daring enough, but because they were smart enough to recognize the danger that lies ahead. While we certainly need to push some boundaries to adapt to the changing world, we also need to value prudence so that we don't ruin ourselves along the way. Victor's project, he wants to do the biggest thing possible, create life, leads him to become enamored with death. After all, he says, if we are to learn what makes us alive, we can learn from how we decay and die. So he's experimenting with body parts that he has taken from graves and charnel houses. Those are places where bodies and bones were stored, often near churches. And we get a pretty gruesome description of what materials he's been working with. So how exactly is he going to create life? He's not actually going to bring a human to life, not from the beginning like a birth, but through reanimation. He'll use electricity to restart a deceased person's tissues. This sounds far-fetched, of course, but is it? After all, we use a defibrillator to jumpstart a dying heart, essentially bringing people back to life. And electricity is built into our bodies naturally, with the spark that becomes our heartbeat and our brain and nervous system, already appearing at the very earliest stages of our embryonic development. And Mary Shelley was aware that scientists were already working on how electricity might be used to bring tissue back to life. So this was actually a realistic goal. Here's some interesting background on the work of 18th century Italian physician and biologist Luigi Galvani.
Galvani was doing experiments with electricity in animal nerves. In the typical experiment, he would prepare a frog by carefully dissecting out the nerves to the legs and mounting them to a board. Gross. His wife would turn the crank on an electrical generator to build up static electricity and get a spark, and then she would touch the legs with a probe. To their amazement, the legs would jump as though the frog were still alive. To further explore the effect of electricity on nerves, they decided to study natural electricity like you would find in a lightning storm. They set up a rooftop experiment in the style of Ben Franklin's kite experiment, where legs were attached to a wire attached to a lightning rod. Nice. The results were clear. Adding electrical impulses to freshly prepared nerves created signals in the nerves that caused movement. To quote Galvani, "And still we could never suppose that fortune were to be so friend to us, such as to allow us to be perhaps the first in handling, as it were, the electricity concealed in nerves, in extracting it from nerves, and in some way putting it under everyone's eyes." These words were so revolutionary in science, and it was so bizarre and captivating that everybody, scientist or not, started trying to reproduce muscle contractions in recently dead animals, especially frogs. 1791 was not a good year to be an Italian frog. One of Galvani's biggest critics, turned rival in this case, was Alessandro Volta. Volta conceded that frogs may be sensitive to the application of electricity from the outside, but he doubted that they had their own electricity stored in them somehow. So Volta set out to prove his case by doing frog experiments of his own. Now, Volta wasn't a very skilled surgeon like Galvani was, so he really had a hard time replicating Galvani's work without damaging the delicate nerves. And so he used mostly intact animals instead of these careful preparations. Still, he was amazed that the frogs were more sensitive to electricity than his own delicate scientific instruments. Through his work, he became aware that using two kinds of metal plates pressed together, called bimetallic arcs, made it possible to store and release electricity. According to this explanation, Galvani's metal equipment, a steel scalpel against a brass plate that the frog leg was mounted on, was the source of the electricity, not anything stored inside the frog. So by using piles of these metal plates, Volta was able to cause not only muscle contractions, but other stuff like tongue sensations and flashes in the eyes, and even more. Now, Galvani wasn't to be outdone, so he found a way to use a severed nerve on the leg muscle to get a contraction with no metal involved whatsoever. He separated and prepared the two legs of a frog with their sciatic nerves sectioned as to make them as long as possible, up near the vertebral column. This time, he used a glass rod, not conductive, to move the nerve corresponding to one of the legs so that it would touch the other nerve in two places. If he could carefully get the cut end of the first nerve to contact the second nerve, then both legs would actually contract. To Galvani, this vindicated him, it proved he was right, and the electricity was in fact somehow stored inside the animal. Now, Volta at this point has shifted his energy to building bigger and bigger piles of these metal plates to generate more and more electricity, which came to be known as voltaic piles. Now, it turns out that it didn't work with just the metal, but when he added paper moistened with salt water between the plates, the first battery was born. Galvani died in 1798, just shortly after this whole exchange, and his work pretty much fell by the wayside for decades afterward without anyone acknowledging that he was, in fact, correct. Meanwhile, Volta was praised for his discoveries and became world famous. This was one of the most important disagreements in scientific history. It resulted in the invention of the electrical battery, which leads to the ability to harness electricity and the discovery of electromagnetism. It also resulted in the birth of the field of electrophysiology, which was foundational to modern neuroscience. When you hear the words volts or voltage and galvanized, think of Galvani and Volta. The measurement of electrical conductance on the surface of the skin is still called galvanic skin response, or GSR, and is still used to measure physiological arousal like they do in lie detector tests. Given its importance, it's no surprise that this exchange was deeply interesting to Erasmus Darwin, who brought it to the attention of the intellectual elites in the English-speaking world. The world was captivated by this strange discovery. Now, Galvani had a nephew named Giovanni Aldini, who followed in his uncle's footsteps studying galvanism, and in 1803 he traveled to London to attend the execution of a prisoner named George Forster. Once Forster was dead by hanging, Aldini connected the body to electrodes and started passing current through it. And this caused the face to contort, an eye to open, and the limbs began to flex and flop around, and the fists clenched. Onlookers were, needless to say, extremely disturbed by this and feared that he might be reviving Forster from the dead. In the introduction to her book, Mary, now known by her married name, Mary Shelley, specifically mentioned that the discussion of galvanism led to her nightmare that inspired her to write and publish her famous book shortly thereafter at only 19 years old.
So Victor's ready for his hypothesis to become reality. He studied the science from all angles. He also says that he never considered anything outside the realm of the physical, the empirical. He says his father took the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition, or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. So Victor has only ever been taught to look at the world scientifically. But that should remind us of Hamlet's famous reminder to his friend Horatio, who was also a science student. There are more things in heaven and earth than what's found in your natural philosophies. In other words, there are strange things that occur in life that we can't necessarily explain with just scientific study. Maybe we don't understand everything as well as we assume we do. In Victor's case, and in ours, that doesn't mean we should necessarily believe in ghosts, though there is one in Hamlet, or other superstitions or the occult, but perhaps we can acknowledge that there are mysteries of nature that we don't and might never be able to grasp. Maybe a little humility is in order. But Victor is anything but humble. Once he commits to creating a human being, he believes there will no longer be boundaries between life and death, that he will be the ultimate creator, that a new species would owe him its existence, and that no father would ever feel the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Victor is setting himself up to become godlike, the one who defeats nature and is glorified for his knowledge, and we should be wary of anyone attempting to give himself such authority. The stage is set for us to see if Victor's grand experiment pays off, if he can bring the dead back to life. Chapter 4 begins with an absolutely brilliant paragraph. It's Gothic in its description, a key literary style during Shelley's era, and we've reached the moment of truth where Victor's experiment pays off. The creature's eye opens, it takes a deep breath, and its limbs twitch to life. Victor attempts to describe how he's feeling, but even though his project appears to be a success, he immediately knows something is wrong. He should be ecstatic that his experiment has worked, but he isn't. Things are not as he anticipated them to be. We must remember that Victor is describing these events in the past tense, thinking back on them as he talks to Walton. So, we must wonder, did he actually feel like this? Instant regret? At the moment it occurred? Or is the regret he feels later, after the events to come, informing his interpretation of these past events, kind of rewriting them in his mind? We often do this. It's a part of a vast array of cognitive biases that make us imperfect beings. We often change the past so we feel better about ourselves in the present or the future. Memory is not fact. It's a story we invent for ourselves. So it's hard to know if Victor's recollection of that climactic moment, of the creature's awakening, is accurate. Victor says he had tried to select beautiful features for his creature, proportionate limbs, thick hair, pearly white teeth, but he realizes the qualities of death are just too overwhelming. No matter how good his materials were, they aren't really alive anymore, so he can't help but notice the eerie water in the eyes, the gray and shriveled skin and black lips. Victor seems to have thought that reanimating flesh could also mean bringing beauty back into the world. He says he wanted to infuse life into an inanimate body. But what exactly is life? He seems to suddenly realize that life is not just the physical, our skin and bones. Even beautiful skin and bones cannot appear lifelike once they're dead. Victor also gives us information regarding his personal timeline. He's been working on this project for nearly 2 years, but here at this moment of truth, he instantly feels regret. Consider how that must feel for Victor. Have you ever devoted years of time to something you thought would be important, but when you came close to achieving it, you either realized it wasn't as important as you thought it would be, or worse, it ended up being something terrible that you hadn't considered? This is the beginning of an important theme in this book, perhaps the most important. Victor assumed that what he was doing was right. He was doing something good. Scientific discovery is good, progress is good, knowledge is good. Only positives, he thought, could come from his hard work and ingenuity. He never considered the negatives. He never considered that he could be doing something monstrous. And this is a concept we need to think about very carefully. Victor is not just a man. He's also a monster. And he's just now awakening to that fact, and it's quite traumatic. And the trauma comes, as it does for most of us, because of an alteration to his identity. Victor is no longer just a scientist, just a researcher in a lab, just a scholar. His intellectual activities have become real in the real world, and they cause real problems for real people. He has suddenly become something new. The old Victor is no more, the man who toiled in obscurity. He's now someone who has brought forth potential evil and destruction, a monster causing mayhem. And this is the problem, that I think, makes studying human beings so difficult, but is also very effective in storytelling. Most of the time, humans think they're doing good. That's why they've chosen to take certain actions. They think they're on the right path. Sometimes people do things that are purposefully evil. They harm people for their own sadistic pleasure or to exhibit power, perhaps, but most of the time, villains think they have the right answer. Think of the most famous bad characters in literature or movies. How many of them have quite rational reasons for their bad actions? But the problem lies within each of us. How often do we assume we are doing the right thing, but we haven't considered the ways we could possibly harm others? We may think we're just men, but at the same time, we are also monsters. It's up to us to understand the difference and learn to control that shadowy side of ourselves. One of the easiest ways to do terrible things is to assume you could only do positive things. You have to know what you're capable of, and Victor is realizing that fact for the first time here. So Victor, in a panic, runs out of the lab and he suddenly bumps into his old friend, Henry, who has arrived in town. But when they return to Victor's home, the creature is no longer there. Victor is happy momentarily, but we as readers must wonder why Victor isn't panicking over where he might have escaped to. Strangely, we don't see Victor in these early moments concerned that a reanimated corpse might be roaming the streets, possibly harming people, and he's the cause of it. Instead, Victor does have a mental breakdown, a severe bout of anxiety and depression. He calls it a fatal passion that keeps him in bed for several months, with Henry caring for him. When Victor recovers, he learns Elizabeth has written to him, and his family back home would like to hear how he's doing. Victor responds in good spirits, but we have to think, how will he tell his loved ones of the terrible thing he's done?